A millionaire rushed to surprise his daughter after months away, only to see her thrown from a school bus like trash. When he realized the frightened, injured girl on the asphalt was his own child, a horrifying truth unraveled. The monster who had been destroying her life was someone inside his own home. Dorian Vale Ashcroft was a man who built cities but somehow lost the smallest corner of his own home. At 39, he ruled one of Manhattan's most aggressive real estate empires. Glass towers carried the Ashcroft name across the skyline, their mirrored surfaces reflecting wealth, ambition, and power. Inside boardrooms, people lowered their voices when he walked in. Competitors feared him. Investors admired him. Journalists called him a visionary. But power had hardened him. 3 years earlier, his wife Maris had died suddenly from a rare illness. The day she was buried, something in Dorian seemed to shut down. Instead of grieving, he buried himself in contracts, acquisitions, and endless expansion projects. Work became his armor. Money became his excuse. He convinced himself his daughter was safe. 8-year-old Alawan Wren Ashcroft lived in the sprawling Ashcroft Manor outside New York, a white stone estate surrounded by rose gardens and iron gates. There were staff members, private tutors, medical specialists, drivers, and security. And most importantly, there was Dorian's mother, Celestine Ashcroft, one of the most respected philanthropists in New York's elite circles. If Celestine was supervising Wren, surely everything was perfect. That was the lie Dorian had told himself for 3 years. On a gray Thursday afternoon, something unusual happened. For the first time in months, Dorian finished a meeting early. He stepped into his graphite Aston Martin parked outside his Manhattan tower and glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:12 p.m. Wren's school day ended at 3:30. An unfamiliar thought crossed his mind. What if I picked her up myself? He imagined the surprise on her face. Maybe she would smile the way she used to when she was little. Maybe they could get ice cream. Maybe just for one afternoon he could pretend he was the kind of father Maris believed he could be. Dorian started the engine. The Aston Martin roared to life and slipped into traffic, carrying him toward St. Aurora Academy. He had no idea that in less than 20 minutes, his entire understanding of his daughter's life was about to shatter. Dorian drove fast as he always did. His Bluetooth headset buzzed in his ear while Manhattan traffic crawled reluctantly ahead of him. "Marcus," he said sharply, gripping the steering wheel, "the harborfront deal should have been finalized this morning." On the other end of the line, his assistant scrambled to explain delays. Dorian's jaw tightened. "You have 15 minutes to fix that mess," he said coldly. "Or clear your desk." He ended the call before Marcus could respond. For Dorian Ashcroft, problems were solved through pressure and speed. His GPS chimed suddenly. Primary route blocked. Rerouting. The navigation system directed him away from the main avenue and toward a narrow suburban road he had never driven before. Oak Ridge Lane. The neighborhood looked older, quieter, a strange contrast to the polished luxury he was used to. Small houses stood shoulder to shoulder, paint faded from years of weather. Ahead of him, a yellow school shuttle slowed and pulled to the curb. Dorian barely paid attention at first. He intended to drive around it. Then something metallic flew out of the bus door. It clattered across the pavement and skidded to a stop near the curb. Dorian frowned. It was a mobility aid, a cheap aluminum walking support, scratched and worn. A second later, a little girl appeared in the bus doorway. She gripped the rail with trembling hands, trying to lower herself carefully to the ground. One of her legs was thinner than the other. She hesitated. The last step was too high. Before she could adjust her balance, the bus driver stormed out behind her. A large woman with harsh eyes. "Move already," the driver snapped. Then she shoved the child violently between the shoulders. The girl lost her balance. She tumbled forward. Her knees slammed against the asphalt. Her small palms scraped hard against the road. A soft cry escaped her lips. Dorian's car screeched to a halt. The afternoon sunlight caught something in the girl's tangled hair. A sapphire butterfly clip. Dorian's blood turned cold. He knew that clip. Maris had given it to their daughter. The child lying on the asphalt was Ren. For a moment, Dorian couldn't breathe. The world around him seemed to freeze, the engine rumbling beneath the hood, the distant noise of traffic, the late afternoon sun burning against the pavement. All he could see was the small figure on the road, his daughter. Ren lay on the asphalt. Her knees scraped raw, her thin hands trembling as she tried to push herself upright. The mobility aid the driver had thrown lay several feet away, out of reach. The bus driver stepped forward again, irritated rather than concerned. "Get up already," she barked. "You're holding everyone up." Something inside Dorian snapped. The Aston Martin's door flew open. He crossed the distance in seconds. Before the driver could react, Dorian grabbed the front of her uniform and slammed her back against the side of the bus. The metal rattled violently. "What the hell did you just do to that child?" Dorian roared. The driver gasped, shocked by the sudden violence. "Let go of me," she shouted. "Who do you think you?" Her voice stopped when she looked into his eyes. Dorian Ashcroft's stare was terrifyingly calm. His suit was perfectly tailored, his watch a rare Patek Philippe, but his expression held the fury of a predator that had just discovered its cub was wounded. "That child," Dorian said slowly, his voice low and lethal, "is my daughter." The driver's face went pale. Inside the bus, several children began crying. Dorian released her with a sharp shove and turned immediately toward Ren. He knelt beside her on the road. "Ren," he said, reaching for her carefully. "Are you hurt?" But instead of relief, the little girl recoiled. She flinched away from his hand, her wide blue eyes filled with panic. "I'm sorry," she whispered through trembling sobs. "I'm sorry, Daddy. Please don't be mad." The words struck Dorian harder than any blow. His daughter was bleeding on the pavement, and she was apologizing to him. In that moment, Dorian Ashcroft realized something far more terrifying than the driver's cruelty. His child was afraid of her own father. Dorian lifted Ren carefully from the pavement. Her small body felt frighteningly light in his arms. Too light. Dust clung to her uniform, and blood trickled from the raw scrapes on her knees. The sight twisted something deep in his chest. Without another word to the bus driver, he carried Ren to the Aston Martin and placed her gently in the passenger seat. The interior smelled of leather and quiet luxury, so clean, it felt almost sterile compared to the dirt on her clothes. Ren sat very still. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. "Are we going home?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Dorian started the engine. "No," he said. The word came out colder than he intended. He pulled away from the curb, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "We're going to your school." St. Aurora Academy stood behind tall black iron gates on a hill overlooking the town, a place of marble columns, manicured gardens, and enormous tuition fees. Dorian had donated millions to the institution over the years. In his mind, it had always been the safest place for his daughter. But when the Aston Martin rolled to the gatehouse, the security guard barely glanced at him. "School hours are over," the guard said lazily, tapping his clipboard. "Come back tomorrow." Dorian lowered the window slowly. "I am Dorian Ashcroft." The guard shrugged. "Rules are rules." For 3 seconds, Dorian said nothing. Then he shifted the car into reverse. The guard smirked, assuming the wealthy father had accepted defeat. The Aston Martin backed up about 20 feet. Then the engine roared. Dorian slammed the accelerator. The car shot forward like a bullet. The aluminum gate barrier exploded apart with a deafening metallic crack. The guard jumped aside, shouting into his radio. Dorian didn't slow down. The Aston Martin tore across the courtyard and screeched to a halt directly in front of the academy's main entrance. He stepped out of the car, lifted Ren into his arms again, and walked straight toward the doors. Tonight, someone was going to explain what had happened to his daughter. The doors of the administration office burst open so violently that the handle slammed against the wall. Headmaster Edmund Crow nearly spilled his espresso across the polished mahogany desk. What in the world? He froze when he recognized the man standing in the doorway. Dorian Vale Ashcroft, one of the Academy's largest benefactors. Crow immediately forced a tight smile. "Mr. Ashcroft?" "I wasn't expecting." Dorian gently placed Wren on the sofa in the corner of the office. Then he turned slowly back toward the desk. Without a word, he pulled Wren's student ID card from his pocket and tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a sharp clack. "Explain this." Crow blinked nervously. "I'm not sure I understand." "My daughter was thrown from a school bus 10 minutes ago," Dorian said. His voice was quiet. Dangerously quiet. "She was treated like garbage by one of your drivers." Crow's face went pale. "There must be some misunderstanding?" "Then fix it." Dorian leaned forward, his hands pressing against the desk. "Why is my daughter being transported on a public shuttle? Why does the driver think she's disposable?" Crow swallowed hard and quickly turned to his computer. "Let me check the system," he muttered. The screen flickered to life. Wren's student profile appeared. Crow's eyes widened. "Oh, that's strange." Dorian's patience snapped. "What?" Crow slowly turned the monitor around. On the screen, a single word blinked in red letters. "Withdrawn." The room went silent. Dorian stared at the word. "That's impossible," he said. "I pay the tuition personally." Crow hesitated before opening a digital document. "There was a withdrawal request filed 3 months ago," he said nervously. "Signed by the student's legal guardian." Dorian reached forward and read the name at the bottom. His blood turned to ice. Celestine Ashcroft, his mother. For several seconds, Dorian couldn't speak. The office felt suddenly too small, the air too heavy. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee in front of Wren. "Sweetheart," he said quietly, forcing gentleness into his voice. "Why didn't you tell me you stopped going to school?" Wren looked down at her scuffed shoes. Her small fingers rubbed nervously against the thin fabric of her skirt. I wasn't supposed to," she whispered. Dorian felt something cold creep through his chest. "What do you mean?" Wren hesitated. Then her hand moved automatically to her left leg, the weaker one, the one she always tried to hide. "Grandma said my leg makes people uncomfortable," she murmured. Crow shifted uncomfortably behind the desk. Dorian didn't even glance at him. Wren continued in a shaky voice. "She said the other kids stared, and that it embarrassed the family." Each word felt like a hammer against Dorian's ribs. "So she moved me upstairs," Wren said. "Upstairs, where the attic room." The word hit the room like a gunshot. Dorian stared at her. "You've been living in the attic?" Wren nodded slowly. "She said it was better if visitors didn't see me." Her voice cracked slightly. "I tried to be good." Dorian's hands trembled. "Then why were you on the bus today?" Wren wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her uniform. "I missed school," she whispered. "I missed it so much." Her lips quivered. "So I climbed out the window this morning." The confession shattered what little composure Dorian had left. "I promise I won't let anyone see my leg," Wren said quickly, a panic rising in her voice. She looked up at him with desperate hope. "Then maybe you won't hate me." Dorian felt something inside his chest break completely. He pulled her into his arms. "No," he said hoarsely. "I could never hate you." Dorian held Wren tightly, feeling her small arms clutching the front of his suit, as if she were afraid he might disappear again. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. The apology cut through him like broken glass. "You don't need to apologize," he said softly. But before he could say anything more, Wren's grip suddenly loosened. Her body sagged in his arms. Wren, her head tilted sideways, her eyes fluttering closed. Dorian's voice cracked with panic. For a split second, no one in the office moved. Then instinct took over. Dorian scooped her up and ran. Headmaster Crow shouted something behind him, but the words barely registered. Dorian stormed through the hallway with the speed of a man fleeing a burning building. The late afternoon sun hit his face as he burst outside. He placed Wren carefully into the Aston Martin's passenger seat, his hands shaking as he fastened the belt. Her skin felt cold. Too cold. "Stay with me," he muttered, starting the engine. The car roared to life. Within seconds, the Aston Martin shot out of the academy courtyard like a silver missile. Traffic lights blurred. Pedestrians jumped back from the curb. Dorian ignored everything except the pale face beside him. "Just hold on," he said hoarsely. The hospital appeared 15 minutes later. Dorian didn't wait for help. He lifted Wren from the car and sprinted into Ashcroft Memorial Hospital. "Doctor," he shouted down the corridor. Medical staff rushed forward with a stretcher. As the emergency doors slammed shut behind them, Dorian found himself alone in the sterile hallway. His hands were still covered in dust from the road. And for the first time in years, Dorian Ashcroft felt something far worse than anger. He felt fear. Real fear. 20 minutes passed like 2 hours. Dorian stood outside the emergency treatment room, staring at the red light above the door. Every second felt heavier than the last. Finally, the doors opened. Dr. Gideon Shaw stepped out, removing his glasses slowly. Dorian moved toward him immediately. "How is she?" Gideon didn't answer right away. Instead, he held up an X-ray film against the hallway light. "This is Wren's left leg," he said quietly. Dorian leaned closer. Even to his untrained eyes, something looked wrong. The muscles appeared thin, weak. "Muscle atrophy," Gideon explained, "and early joint stiffness." Dorian frowned. "That's impossible. I pay for weekly physical therapy." Gideon looked at him sharply. "Then someone's lying to you?" He flipped through a tablet containing Wren's blood test results. Severe iron deficiency, calcium levels dangerously low, protein levels critically depleted. Dorian felt his stomach drop. "What does that mean?" Gideon looked him straight in the eye. "It means your daughter hasn't been eating properly for months." The hallway went silent. "That's ridiculous," Dorian said. "She has a private nanny, a nutritionist, a therapist." Gideon's voice hardened. "Well, according to her medical condition, none of them have been doing their job." Dorian immediately pulled out his phone and dialed. "Agnes," he said when the call connected. But the line went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Still nothing. Within minutes, Rowan Pierce sent a report to his phone. Dorian opened it. His heart stopped. "Agnes Bell dismissed 4 months ago. Replacement caretaker Sabine Voss. Background former disciplinary supervisor at a closed juvenile correction facility. Authorization signed by Celestine Ashcroft." Dorian slowly lowered the phone. The anger he had felt earlier was gone. Something colder had replaced it. Wren woke up an hour later in a quiet hospital room. The first thing she saw was her father sitting beside the bed. Dorian looked different somehow. The anger that had filled his eyes earlier was gone, replaced by something steadier. Something protective. "Daddy," she whispered. "I'm here," he said gently. He reached forward and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "You fainted earlier." Wren blinked slowly. "Are we going home?" The question carried a hint of fear. Dorian understood immediately. She wasn't afraid of the hospital. She was afraid of the house. He leaned closer so only she could hear him. "We are going home," he said quietly. "But we're going to play a game." Wren's eyes widened slightly. "What kind of game?" "A secret mission," Dorian said. "Like spies." Wren looked at him with cautious curiosity. "You and I are going to pretend nothing happened today." "Why? Because there are people in that house who think they're very clever." Dorian replied calmly. "And sometimes the best way to beat clever people is to let them believe they've already won." Wren thought about this for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. I can do that. Dorian smiled faintly. I know you can. He helped her sit up carefully and wrapped a soft blanket around her shoulders. Then he lowered his voice again. Just remember one thing. What Dorian looked directly into his daughter's blue eyes. You are not the problem. For a moment, Ren looked like she might cry. Instead, she squeezed his hand. And for the first time that day, Dorian felt something unfamiliar return to his chest. Hope. Ashcroft Manor stood like a palace carved from white stone. Tall iron gates opened slowly as Dorian's Aston Martin rolled up the long, circular driveway. Perfectly trimmed rose gardens stretched across the grounds, their red petals glowing in the fading afternoon light. From the outside, the mansion looked like something out of a magazine, wealth, beauty, and prestige woven into every architectural line. But to Ren, the house looked different. It looked like a prison. Dorian stepped out of the car and walked around to the passenger side. Instead of lifting her immediately, he carefully pulled a brand new wheelchair from the trunk. The sleek frame gleamed under the driveway lights. Easy, he murmured, lifting Ren gently into it. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders and stared at the enormous front doors of the manor. Her small fingers tightened on the armrests. Dorian noticed. Remember the mission, he whispered quietly. Ren nodded. Together they entered the house. The interior smelled faintly of lilies and expensive furniture polish. Classical music drifted softly through hidden speakers. Everything looked calm, elegant. Perfect. In the center of the living room sat Celestine Ashcroft. She was dressed in a deep crimson silk gown, reclining gracefully in a velvet armchair while sipping tea from delicate bone china. Even at 63, Celestine was striking sharp cheekbones, silver hair swept into an immaculate style, eyes cold and intelligent. She looked up as they entered. For half a second, something unpleasant flashed across her face when she saw the wheelchair. Then the expression vanished. "Oh, Dorian," she said smoothly, setting down her teacup. "You're home early." Her gaze moved toward Ren. "My poor child," she added with theatrical concern. "Why does she look so exhausted?" Dorian kept his voice steady. "She wore herself out today." "I warned you," Celestine sighed, fanning herself lightly. "The girl is fragile. Too much stimulation makes her ill." Ren shrank slightly in the wheelchair. Dorian noticed every detail. The way she lowered her head, the way she tried to make herself invisible, and the way Celestine never once stood up to greet her granddaughter. "I took her for ice cream after school," Dorian continued calmly. Celestine clicked her tongue. "You indulge her too much." Then she raised her voice. Sabine footsteps echoed from the hallway. A thin woman emerged from the shadows. Sabine Voss. Her sharp eyes immediately locked onto Ren. The child's breathing became shallow. Dorian saw the fear ripple through her body like a shockwave. "Take the girl upstairs," Celestine ordered dismissively. "Give her medicine and put her to bed early." Sabine approached the wheelchair. Her bony hand settled heavily on Ren's shoulder. Dorian saw Ren flinch, but she didn't make a sound. Their eyes met briefly. The silent plea in his daughter's gaze nearly shattered his restraint. Dorian slipped his hands into his pockets. He couldn't act yet, not until the trap was ready. "Take good care of her," he said quietly. Sabine smirked slightly. "Yes, sir." She wheeled Ren toward the elevator. The sound of the wheels rolling across the polished floor echoed through the enormous room. And with every turn of the wheels, Dorian felt his anger sharpen into something colder, something far more dangerous than rage. Sabine pushed the wheelchair down the long hallway toward the elevator. The mansion felt eerily quiet. Every step echoed. Ren kept her eyes lowered, staring at the marble floor. Sabine's grip tightened on her shoulder. "Clumsy today, weren't you?" the woman muttered coldly. Ren said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was safer. Behind them in the living room, Celestine returned to her tea as though nothing unusual had happened. Speaking of charity, she said to Dorian, casually flipping through a fashion magazine, I have the Ashcroft Children's Legacy Gala this weekend. Dorian nodded slowly. Yes, I heard. It will be a magnificent evening, Celestine said proudly. The entire city council will be there. The press, the donors. She smiled slightly. They're honoring me as Woman of the Year. Dorian poured himself a glass of water. His reflection in the crystal surface looked strangely unfamiliar. I know, he said. Celestine looked up. Oh, Headmaster Crow called earlier, Dorian explained calmly. He mentioned the ceremony. Celestine's smile widened. That man has always had excellent taste. He also said they want to highlight your work with disabled children, Dorian added. Her expression brightened instantly. Of course they do. She stood and began pacing the room, already imagining the cameras, the applause, the admiration. It's important for society to see compassion, she said, especially for unfortunate children. Dorian watched her carefully. The irony was almost unbearable. Meanwhile, upstairs, Sabine wheeled Ren into the attic corridor. The air there was colder. Dust floated in the dim light. The room at the end of the hall opened with a creak. Inside was a small bed, a desk, and a narrow window. Ren's room. Sabine stopped the wheelchair abruptly. You're lucky today, she said coldly. Your father came home early. Ren didn't respond. Sabine leaned closer. Don't think it changes anything. She squeezed the girl's shoulder hard enough to make her wince. Downstairs, Dorian finished his water and set the glass aside. You should prepare carefully for the gala, he told Celestine. Why is that? She asked. Dorian's voice became very quiet. Because the whole city will be watching. Celestine smiled proudly. She had no idea how true that statement was. The following morning, Ashcroft Manor buzzed with unusual activity. Servants moved quickly through the hallways while Celestine prepared for an entire day of beauty treatments before the gala. Careful with that dress bag, she snapped at a maid. It's Valentino. From the second-floor balcony, Dorian watched silently. A long, black limousine waited outside. Within minutes, Celestine swept out of the house like a queen leaving her palace. The car doors closed. The limousine disappeared beyond the iron gates. The moment the vehicle vanished, Dorian turned and walked down the hallway. His destination was a door no one was allowed to enter. Celestine's private study. The door was locked, but Dorian had grown up in this house. He knew where the spare keys were hidden. The lock clicked open. Inside, the study smelled strongly of perfume and old paper. Portraits of Celestine decorated the walls, Celestine at charity galas, Celestine with politicians, Celestine shaking hands with dignitaries. At the center of the room hung the largest painting of all, Celestine sitting on a throne-like chair. Dorian walked directly toward it. He lifted the heavy frame. Behind it was a modern steel safe. He entered several combinations. The first two failed. Then he paused. His father's funeral date. The safe clicked open. Inside were stacks of financial records and ledgers. Dorian began flipping through them. The numbers told a story far uglier than he had imagined. January, received from Dorian Ashcroft $50,000 for Ren's tuition and therapy. Spent on Ren $1,800. Transferred to Celestine Ashcroft Image Fund $48,200. February, received $50,000. Spent on Ren $900. Transferred to Image Fund $49,100. Each page felt like a hammer striking his chest. His daughter had been starving, while his mother bought diamonds and funded charity galas. Then he noticed a small yellow envelope tucked into the corner of the safe. His heart stopped when he saw the handwriting. Maris. Dorian opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a wrinkled letter. Mother Celestine, I know you never approved of me, but please, if anything happens to me, take care of Ren. She is innocent. A dark shoe mark stained one corner of the paper. Celestine had stepped on it. Dorian closed his eyes slowly. When he opened them again, the grief was gone. Only resolve remained. He pulled out his phone and began photographing every document. The gala was only 2 nights away, and now Dorian Ashcroft finally had everything he needed. Dorian locked the study door behind him and walked back to his bedroom with the measured calm of a man carrying dynamite in his hands. The photographs on his phone were enough to bury Celestine socially, legally, and financially. The ledgers, the transfers, Maris's letter, each piece was a blade. But Dorian knew one thing with terrible clarity: documents could still be explained away. Excuses could still be invented. Lawyers could still try to muddy the truth. What he needed now was something no polished speech could survive. He needed the world to see what had been done to his daughter. Inside his room, he opened his laptop and connected to the hidden cameras he had planted earlier. The screen split into 3 live views of the attic bedroom. One from the teddy bear near the bed, one from the curtain fold by the narrow window, and one from the ceiling light above. Ren was asleep, at first curled on her side beneath a thin blanket, her face pale against the pillow. Even in sleep, she looked tense, as though her little body no longer trusted rest. One hand was tucked beneath her cheek. The other lay over her weak leg, as if she were protecting it even from dreams. Dorian sat down slowly. He did not blink. Minutes passed. Then the attic door opened. Sabine Voss entered carrying a metal tray. The sound alone was ugly, the hollow clatter of cheap dishes against steel. On the tray sat a torn piece of stale bread and a shallow bowl of watery soup, already losing what little heat it had. She dropped the tray onto the floor with a loud bang. Ren jolted awake in terror. "Up," Sabine snapped. Ren pushed herself upright too quickly, disoriented, frightened. Her gaze went immediately to the tray, then to the walking support beside the bed. Instinctively, she reached for it. Sabine's foot shot out. The metal support skidded across the floor and slammed into the wall. Ren froze. On the laptop screen, Dorian's hand tightened so hard around the edge of the desk that his knuckles whitened. "Who told you that you could use that?" Sabine asked coldly. Ren's lips trembled. "My leg hurts." Sabine folded her arms. "The mistress said useless girls don't need comforts. If you want to eat, you crawl." Dorian stopped breathing. For a moment, Ren didn't move. She simply stared at the tray like a little animal trying to understand a trap. Her eyes filled, but she made no sound. Somewhere inside that silence was the history of all the punishments she had already learned to fear. "Please," she whispered. "It hurts today." Sabine's expression did not change. "No crawling," she said, "no food." Then she began to count. 1. On the screen, Ren lowered her gaze. 2. Her small hands moved slowly onto the mattress. 3. Ren slid off the bed. Dorian made a sound, then barely human, more exhale than voice. His daughter landed on the floor awkwardly, one knee bending wrong, her palms flattening against the boards. She paused, gathering breath, then began dragging herself forward. Her weak leg trailed behind her. The movement was clumsy, painful, humiliating. She tried to move quietly, as if even suffering had to be done politely in this house. Dorian's vision blurred red. He half rose from the chair. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to storm upstairs, break down the door, and put his hands around Sabine's throat. He imagined it with terrifying ease, the impact, the silence after the release of fury. But then he saw Ren's face. She was biting her lip so hard it nearly turned white, trying not to cry aloud, trying not to anger the monster standing over her. And Dorian understood that if he acted now, he would save one moment and lose the war. Sabine would disappear. Celestine would deny everything. The house would clean itself like it always had. No, not this time. This time they would be destroyed in daylight. Ren reached the tray at last. Her hand shook as she touched the bread. Sabine stared down at her with a thin smile of satisfaction. "See," she said. You can learn. That was when the desk edge cracked under Dorian's grip. The sound was sharp in the bedroom. On screen, Ren flinched at even that tiny noise through the speaker feedback as if danger had become the language of her world. Dorian closed the laptop with a violent snap. The image was gone, but not from his mind. It burned there. His daughter crawling for food. His mother's house, his money, his failure. He bent forward, bracing both hands against his knees, breathing through a rage so immense it felt volcanic. Then inch by inch, the fire hardened into something colder and deadlier. Precision, judgment, finality. Just a little longer, baby girl, he whispered into the silence. His voice broke on the last word. Then he straightened, picked up his phone, and called Rowan. Tonight, Dorian said, every syllable carved from ice. We stopped being careful. Evening settled over Ashcroft Manor in layers of gold and shadow. The chandeliers downstairs had already been lit, flooding the lower floors with warm, amber elegance. Music drifted softly through the hallways. Staff prepared for the gala the next day, moving like silent ghosts through the mansion. Everything looked refined, controlled, beautiful. But on the top floor in the attic corridor, the house felt different. Colder, smaller, ashamed. Dorian stood outside Ren's door for a long moment before opening it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust medicine and old wood. A child's life had been reduced to this narrow room under the roof, one iron-framed bed, a worn nightstand, a small dresser, a desk pushed beside the window, and a stuffed teddy bear with thinning fur. The room was tidy in the heartbreaking way neglected children often keep their spaces tidy, as if order might somehow earn them kindness. Ren was sitting on the bed in her nightdress, her legs tucked carefully beneath the blanket. A tray with untouched food sat on the table nearby. She looked up when he entered, and for one small, painful second, fear flashed across her face before she recognized him. Daddy Dorian shut the door behind him. He crossed the room, slowly carrying a fresh bowl of warm soup and a plate of buttered toast he had prepared himself downstairs after dismissing the kitchen staff. The absurdity of that was not lost on him. He could negotiate billion-dollar developments without flinching, yet carrying soup to his daughter felt more important than any contract he had ever signed. I thought you might be hungry, he said. Ren looked uncertain. Sabine said I already ate. Dorian set the tray aside. She was wrong. He sat beside her on the bed. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he lifted the spoon, blew gently on the soup, and held it out. Ren stared at him as though she were seeing something impossible. You're feeding me. The question nearly destroyed him. He swallowed hard. Yes. She opened her mouth and took the first spoonful, slowly, cautiously, as if kindness itself might be taken away if she reached for it too fast. He fed her the second spoonful, the third, the fourth. By the time she took the toast from his hand, her eyes looked damp. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an old clock somewhere in the hall. Then Ren spoke in a very small voice. Are you going away again? Dorian froze. It was not accusation in her tone. It was worse. It was expectation, the kind born from long disappointment. He set the bowl down carefully and turned toward her fully. In the weak yellow light of the bedside lamp, she looked impossibly young, more child than he had allowed himself to see, more fragile than any report or photograph could ever have shown him. He took her small hand in both of his. Listen to me, he said. Ren looked up. I need you to hear this, and I need you to believe me, even if it takes time. His voice roughened. None of this is your fault. Not your leg, not the attic, not the school, not the way they treated you, none of it. Her chin trembled. But Grandma said I know what she said. His tone stayed gentle, but something dark moved beneath it. She lied. Ren blinked. Dorian kept going because if he stopped now, he might never forgive himself. I should have seen it sooner. I should have been here. I should have asked more questions. I should have protected you. He bowed his head for just a second, then lifted it again. I was absent while you suffered. That ends now. Tears spilled down Ren's cheeks. Really, yes. He brushed one tear away with his thumb. You never needed to be perfect to be loved, he whispered. You never needed to hide your leg. You never needed to earn your place in this family. You were always enough. You are my daughter. That is the whole truth. Ren made a small broken sound and leaned forward. Dorian opened his arms instinctively. She folded into him. At first, her hug was hesitant, uncertain, the embrace of a child, testing whether safety is real. Then she clung to him with both arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. Dorian held her as carefully as if she were made of light and glass. I missed you, she whispered. That did it. He closed his eyes, and the grief he had been holding in all day ripped through him, not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to hollow bone. I know, he said hoarsely. I know. After a long time, he leaned back just enough to look at her. Tomorrow night, he said, something is going to happen. You don't need to be afraid. You won't be alone. Ren wiped her cheeks. Is it part of the mission? A faint, aching smile touched his mouth. Yes, soldier. The final part. She nodded solemnly, as if accepting an assignment far beyond her years. Dorian tucked the blanket around her, kissed her forehead, and rose to leave. At the door, he turned back. Ren was still watching him. This time there was fear in her eyes. But there was something else now, too. Trust, not whole, not healed, not yet, but beginning. And for Dorian Ashcroft, that fragile beginning felt more sacred than every cathedral of wealth his name had ever built. The Ashcroft Children's Legacy Gala glittered like a lie made visible. The Plaza Ballroom had been transformed into a cathedral of wealth and virtue. Thousands of white roses spilled from crystal urns. Candlelight shimmered against glass. Gold-trimmed place cards sat beside diamond-pale china. Waiters in black jackets floated through the room with silver trays offering champagne to politicians, board members, trustees, socialites, media executives, and old-money philanthropists who spoke of compassion while checking reflected versions of themselves in mirrored walls. Everything smelled of roses, perfume, and expensive hypocrisy. Tonight, Celestine Ashcroft would be celebrated as Woman of the Year for her extraordinary devotion to vulnerable children, and everyone had come to watch her glow. Backstage, through a service entrance near the loading corridor, Dorian wheeled Ren slowly past cables, storage trunks, and stacks of audio equipment. The contrast was almost obscene. On one side of the velvet curtain, applause, silk jewels, and cameras. On the other, exposed wires, dust, sweat, and truth waiting in darkness. Ren wore a soft, pale blue dress beneath a sapphire shawl draped over her lap. Her hair had been brushed carefully, the butterfly clip placed above one ear. She looked delicate, beautiful, and terribly brave. Her hands trembled in her lap. Dorian noticed and knelt in front of her. There are a lot of people out there, she whispered. I know. What if Grandma gets angry? Dorian took her hands gently in his. Then she gets angry. Ren searched his face. This close, Dorian could see the ghost of old fear trying to rise in her eyes. He leaned in and lowered his voice until it became the calmest sound in the room. Listen to me, Ren. Tonight you do not hide. Tonight nobody gets to pretend you don't exist. Nobody gets to decide your worth. Not her. Not them. Not ever again. Ren swallowed and nodded. Okay. Dorian kissed her forehead. That's my girl. A few feet away, Rowan Pierce stood beside the technical console dressed in black, an earpiece tucked discreetly behind one ear. His expression was sharp and controlled. Everything's in place, Rowan said quietly when Dorian rose. The media list expanded. Police waiting for your signal. Child Protective Services too. The legal packet distributed electronically and hard copy. If anyone tries to bury this, 10 other people already have it. Dorian gave a single nod. On the ballroom monitors, a live feed showed Celestine making her way through the crowd. She wore an emerald Valentino gown that caught the chandelier light like shards of green fire. People touched her arm, kissed her cheek, praised her heart, her generosity, her years of service. She accepted it all with a saint's smile and a queen's appetite. She really believes she's untouchable, Rowan murmured. Dorian's gaze remained fixed on the screen. That's why this will work. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra softened, the lights dimmed by degrees. A hush rolled over the guests as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, his smile broad and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, tonight we honor a woman whose compassion has changed countless young lives. Applause began before he even said her name. Backstage, Ren flinched at the sound. Dorian placed one hand on her shoulder, not restraining, not directing, simply there. The host continued, his voice rich with ceremony. A guardian of dignity, a champion of children, a beacon of legacy and grace. Please welcome this year's Ashcroft Children's Legacy Woman of the Year. The ballroom erupted. Mrs. Celestine Ashcroft beyond the curtain, the applause swelled like thunder. Ren looked up at her father. Dorian looked down at his daughter. In his face there was no longer hesitation, no lingering uncertainty, no grief powerful enough to weaken him. What remained was purpose sharpened to a blade. Tonight he would not merely expose cruelty. He would rip the mask off power in front of the very people who worshipped it. Celestine stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation. Backstage, Rowan's hand hovered above the control panel. Dorian straightened, his fingers curling around the handles of Ren's wheelchair. The ballroom roared for a liar, but only for a few more minutes. The ballroom lights dimmed until only the stage remained illuminated. Crystal chandeliers reflected 1,000 tiny sparks across the audience. Cameras from several media outlets were already positioned along the edges of the room, their lenses trained on the podium. Celestine Ashcroft stepped forward with flawless poise. Applause rolled through the hall like thunder. She paused in the spotlight, allowing the sound to wash over her. Her emerald gown shimmered under the lights, the fabric flowing elegantly as she approached the microphone. At 63, she still carried herself like a queen of old aristocracy. Chin-high shoulders, straight, every movement carefully measured. She smiled warmly at the audience. My dear friends, she began, her voice smooth and emotional. Standing here tonight, I feel deeply humbled. Several guests nodded approvingly. Celestine placed a delicate hand over her chest. For decades, I have believed that the greatest measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable children. Soft murmurs of agreement spread through the room. My work has always been guided by compassion, she continued, especially for children who face physical challenges. In the shadows behind the curtain, Ren stiffened. Dorian's hand rested gently on her shoulder. On stage, Celestine dabbed her eye with a silk handkerchief. In fact, she said softly, my greatest inspiration is my own beloved granddaughter, Elowen. The crowd reacted immediately. Several women gasped sympathetically. Celestine sighed dramatically. Ren was born with difficulties in her leg, she explained. But despite this hardship, she has shown remarkable courage. Dorian felt Ren tremble slightly beneath his hand. Celestine continued. She is currently receiving specialized treatment at a rehabilitation facility in Switzerland. Though we are separated by distance, her strength inspires every act of charity I perform. The lie landed perfectly. The audience erupted into warm applause. People wiped their eyes. Some even stood. Behind the curtain, Rowan Pierce glanced at Dorian. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. Dorian said nothing. His eyes never left the stage. The woman speaking in that golden spotlight had starved his daughter, hidden her from the world. and stolen the money meant to heal her. Yet here she stood, praised as a saint. Celestine spread her arms slightly, basking in the admiration. "This award is not for me," she declared graciously. "It is for every child who struggles, every family who endures hardship, and every heart brave enough to show compassion." More applause, more admiration, more lies. Rowan's hand hovered above the console. Dorian leaned down toward Ren. "It's time," he whispered. She looked up at him, nervous but determined. He nodded once. Then Dorian Ashcroft pushed the wheelchair forward. The velvet curtain parted, and the truth walked into the light. At first, only the people closest to the aisle noticed. A man in a dark suit pushing a wheelchair slowly into the ballroom. The wheels rolled softly across the thick red carpet. The sound was almost silent, but the presence was impossible to ignore. One by one, heads turned. Conversations stopped. The applause faded in confused waves. Celestine noticed the shift in the room and frowned slightly. Her speech faltered. She followed the direction of the audience's gaze, and then she saw them. Her son, and the child who was supposed to be invisible. For a moment, Celestine looked as if the air had been punched out of her lungs. "Dorian," she said into the microphone. Her voice echoed awkwardly across the hall. Dorian said nothing. He continued pushing the wheelchair straight down the center aisle. Every camera turned. Every whisper spread faster than fire. Is that the granddaughter I thought she was overseas?" The murmurs grew louder. Dorian stopped the wheelchair directly at the foot of the stage. Then he stepped forward and walked up the stairs alone. His shoes echoed sharply against the wooden platform. Celestine took a step backward. "Dorian, what are you doing?" she asked quietly, trying to maintain composure. Dorian reached out. He removed the microphone gently from her hand. The ballroom fell completely silent. He turned slowly toward the audience. Hundreds of faces stared back at him, some curious, some confused, some already uneasy. Dorian raised the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, his voice carried clearly across the hall. "The woman you are applauding tonight calls herself a protector of vulnerable children." He paused. Behind him, Celestine's face tightened with alarm. "But before you continue celebrating her," Dorian continued, "there is something you deserve to see." He snapped his fingers once. Across the room, Rowan pressed a single key. The giant LED screen behind the stage went black. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered back to life. The first image appeared, a shaky video recording of a yellow school shuttle pulling to the curb. The bus door opened. An aluminum mobility aid was thrown violently onto the pavement. Gasps erupted through the ballroom. The next image appeared, a little girl stumbling from the bus, then being shoved onto the asphalt. The audio blasted through the speakers. "Get out of my way, you useless trash." The entire room froze. The girl's face was unmistakable. Elawan Ashcroft. Ren. The saint of charity standing beside Dorian suddenly looked less like a hero and more like a criminal about to be exposed. The ballroom fell into stunned silence. On the massive screen behind the stage, the video continued playing. The sound of the bus driver shouting echoed harshly through the speakers. "Move already! You're slowing everyone down." The footage showed Ren struggling to stand. Her knees scraped her small hands, shaking, as she tried to reach the mobility aid lying several feet away. Several guests covered their mouths. Someone whispered, "My God." Celestine's face drained of color. "That video is fake," she shouted suddenly. "Turn it off." But Dorian didn't even look at her. He faced the audience. "That happened yesterday," he said calmly. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. "Outside St. Aurora Academy," he continued. The screen went black for a moment. Then another video appeared. This one was sharper, clearer. The camera angle showed a small attic bedroom. Ren sat on the edge of the bed. The door opened. Sabine Voss entered carrying a tray. A few seconds later, she kicked Ren's mobility aid across the room. Gasps grew louder. The speakers filled with Sabine's cold voice. "If you want to eat, crawl for it." A horrified murmur swept across the ballroom. On screen, Ren slowly lowered herself to the floor. Her small body dragged painfully across the wooden boards as she crawled toward the bowl of soup. Someone in the audience began crying. One of the donors slammed his glass down on the table. "This is abuse," he said loudly. Celestine lunged toward Dorian. "Stop this right now," she hissed. But the video continued. Dorian raised his hand. "Wait," he said quietly. "There's more." The screen switched again. This time it displayed a scanned ledger page. Numbers filled the screen. Every month, Dorian explained, his voice steady. "I transferred $50,000 for my daughter's medical care." Another page appeared, then another. And every month he continued. Almost all of that money was transferred into a private account. The next image zoomed in on a signature. Celestine Ashcroft. Murmurs exploded through the crowd. "Those are lies," Celestine shouted. Dorian finally turned toward her. "No," he said quietly. "They're records." Behind him, the final piece of evidence appeared. An audio recording began to play. Celestine's own voice filled the ballroom speakers. "Remove the crippled girl from the school. I don't want her embarrassing the Ashcroft name." The recording ended. The silence afterward was suffocating. Every camera in the room turned toward Celestine Ashcroft. The woman who had entered the gala as a saint now stood exposed as something else entirely. The silence inside the ballroom became unbearable. Hundreds of people stared at Celestine Ashcroft. The elegant philanthropist who had been applauded minutes earlier now stood frozen beneath the stage lights, her perfect composure cracking under the weight of the evidence. Camera flashes exploded across the room. "Mrs. Ashcroft," one reporter shouted. "Did you embezzle charity funds?" Another voice followed immediately. "Did you imprison your own granddaughter?" Celestine's breathing became erratic. "This is a setup," she screamed, grabbing the microphone stand. "My son is trying to destroy me." But the crowd had already turned. A bank chairman seated near the front table stood up slowly. He tore a donation check in half. "Disgusting," he muttered. Others followed. Chairs scraped across the floor as guests began backing away from the stage, their admiration transforming into open revulsion. Celestine's fury exploded. "You fools!" she shouted, her voice cracking through the speakers. "You think you're better than me?" She pointed wildly toward Ren, sitting at the foot of the stage. "That child is a defect," she spat. The words echoed through the hall. "A crippled embarrassment. I had to hide her to protect the Ashcroft name." Gasps erupted. The last fragile mask shattered. Everything she had spent decades building collapsed in seconds. Celestine Ashcroft had just condemned herself. The ballroom doors burst open. 2 uniformed police officers entered, followed by a stern woman from Child Protective Services. The crowd parted instantly. Their footsteps echoed across the marble floor as they approached the stage. Dorian stepped aside. He had already sent every piece of evidence hours earlier. The officer stopped in front of Celestine. "Celestine Ashcroft," he announced firmly. "You are under arrest." Celestine stared at him in disbelief. For what? The officer's voice carried clearly across the room. Child abuse, unlawful confinement, financial fraud, embezzlement of trust funds. Gasps rippled through the crowd again. "No," Celestine whispered. "This is impossible." The second officer stepped forward and pulled her hands behind her back. Click. The handcuffs closed around her wrists. The sound was sharp. "Final. You have the right to remain silent," the officer continued. Celestine's composure shattered completely. "Dorian," she screamed as they began leading her away. "Tell them to stop. Everything I did was for this family." Dorian didn't move. He simply held Ren in his arms, shielding her from the chaos. Celestine twisted desperately as the officers escorted her toward the exit. "Don't let them take me," she begged. Dorian finally spoke. His voice was calm, cold. "You always said reputation was everything," he said quietly. Celestine froze. "Well," he continued, "tomorrow the entire world will know your name." The officers led her through the doors, and just like that, Celestine Ashcroft lost everything. 1 month later, autumn sunlight covered a quiet Connecticut suburb. Golden leaves drifted across the road as a white SUV pulled into the parking lot of Cedar Brook Day School. Inside the car, Ren pressed her face to the window. "It's pretty," she said softly. Dorian smiled faintly. The past month had changed everything. Celestine's accounts had been frozen. St. Aurora Academy lost its operating license under investigation. Sabine Voss and the bus driver both faced criminal charges. And Ren was healing. Her cheeks were no longer hollow. Her bright blue eyes had lost the constant shadow of fear. Dorian stepped out of the SUV and opened the back door. Instead of lifting her immediately, he paused. "Want to try on your own?" he asked gently. Ren grinned. "I can." She reached for her new mobility supports, lightweight pink braces specially designed for her therapy. Carefully, she stepped down onto the pavement. Slow, but steady. "I did it," she said proudly. "You did," Dorian replied. At the school entrance, a group of children rushed past them. One boy stopped and held the door open for her. "Cool braces," he said cheerfully. Ren laughed. "They're my superhero gear." She turned and waved at her father. "Bye, Daddy." Dorian stood beside the SUV, watching her disappear inside the building. For a long moment, he didn't move. 3 years ago, he had believed skyscrapers and fortunes were the greatest achievements of his life. Now he knew the truth. Nothing in the world was more important than protecting the small girl who had just walked through that door. Dorian Ashcroft started the engine, not as a billionaire, but as a father. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next story.